Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond. Be sure to hit like and subscribe so others can find the channel. Today we have a guest that we're going to talk about a very, very important topic. John Travers is a pastor, Navy veteran, police officer, private investigator, entrepreneur, and author. His investigative work has been featured in USA Today, NBC Nightly News, People Magazine, HBO Vice, and in the TV series Renegade. Welcome, Joseph. Nice to have you on to Beyond.
Oh, great. Hey, nice having you here. And this Zoom, I actually never thought I'd get used to the Zoom, but this
Right.
is really cool where you can like two places at once, right?
It's interesting because I think it's opened up business in ways that businesses didn't envision or appreciate. From certainly with the COVID era, I think that hopefully it's a sign of things to come at some level, and I think it makes it more efficient. We can meet quickly and effortlessly, but we can still dive into some really critical information for sure.
Great.
Well, Joseph, as I read your background, as I mentioned when we were talking before the show, wow is all I can say. You're exceptionally accomplished, and the areas that you're focused on is very intriguing to me. So if you can sort of take the audience, if you can give us a quick 60-second summary of the path you took to get to your current position today, I think that would be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. After high school, went to college for a year, joined the United States Navy, got out of the Navy, went into police work right away. Was in police work in the 80s, and worked around a lot of areas in Los Angeles County, high gang infested, drugs, that type of thing going on. Left law enforcement and got into licensed private investigation, started my own school, ended up to be the largest private investigation school in the country. During part of that transformation, I became born again, went to Bible college, and this is after all my regular Cal State Long Beach and everything, after publishing my first textbook, and became a pastor in 2000. And I was doing various ministries. And in 2009, I read an article about a young girl, Brittany Drexel, that ran away. And I knew from my time in law enforcement and in private investigation that this evil triad of street gang members, prison gang members, and the cartel had taken over narcotics trafficking and now had taken over child sex trafficking just the year before, around 2008. So I read another article about a month later about United States Navy SEALs going overseas and rescuing children. So I got a hold of these guys and I says, hey, do you know what's going on here in this country with our American children? And they said, I had no idea. So we formed Saved in America with 3 pillars. Now, first pillar, all volunteer force. Number 2, never charge parents. And number 3, only use former special operators like Navy SEALs and former police officers to become licensed, insured private investigators and try to get the missing kids before the bad guys do.
Right. So let me step back a little bit. So as you got out of the Navy, where did your passion for law enforcement take root? I mean, not everybody thinks in those terms, right? When you get out, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do. Where did that sort of spark hit you where you said, I want to go into law enforcement as a career?
I always grew up, my godfather was a lieutenant at a local police department. My great uncle was a commander for Los Angeles Police Department. Actually, he retired out after 43 years with the #1 badge in LAPD.
Wow.
And he was sort of an inspiration to the family. So I always had that in my mind. And then through a series of, going back to college after I got out of the Navy, I decided, well, hey, maybe let's go swimming in law enforcement and see where that goes.
Right. So you mentioned as I was reading your background, you mentioned you got a BS in criminal justice, and I know you're working on a master's in science in criminal justice. How would you say your education prepared you for the real world of criminal justice? I mean, if people are thinking about getting into criminal justice, is it more important to start within the police, a police force, and going up that way in your education, or does a background in college is it helpful to the area, if you will?
I think, when I look at it, I was glad I had at least a little over a year of college before I got into law enforcement and finished the rest of my degree on the street, working graveyards and studying when I could, kind of thing. But going to college, not necessarily what you learn so much. It's some of the methodology you learn from it, how to do research properly, how to look up and see what's true and what's not true, especially in our time.
Right.
I mean, you turn on the news, what's true? What is this? I mean, and then you do your own research and find out, hey, that's not true. How come they're doing that? So I think that's really, really important to understand research and methodology and apply that then, of course, to the real world. And I think you need both.
Right. That's a great distinction I've never heard before. And I would agree with that 100%. Let me go back. You mentioned that with child sex trafficking, et cetera, you have gangs, you have cartels. How influential are cartels across the border in what's going on with child sex trafficking today?
Oh, that's everything. The border is everything, only because that is where the players are, the bad guys. So let me just call them what it is. These are the bad guys. This is the enemy when it comes to child sex trafficking. You have and for your audience, I'll just go ahead and lay it out just a little bit, if that's okay.
Please.
You have your street gang members, and I think everybody understands what a street gang member is, but I'll just lay it out a little. Street gang members are racist organizations in and of themselves. So you have your white street gang members, which are usually your neo-Nazi type and that stuff. You have your motorcycle gangs, etc. Okay, then you have your black street gang members, which divide into either the Crips or the Bloods, the blue or the red. And they call themselves different things, but it's all across the country. Those are the two main outfits for it. Then you have your Hispanic street gang members, which come from different areas, but 18th Street is one of the bigger ones. And then now we have MS-13 in the gang, but they all kind of weed out from those areas. So to be a Hispanic street gang member, you have to be Hispanic. You can't be white or black. Although there has been a small crossover in that, but not much. Black, you have to be black because that's the way, like I said, they're racist organizations in and of themselves. And white, you have to be white. So then you have prison gangs. Now, prison gangs all started in California and spread out across the country. And your main prison gangs are your Aryan Brotherhood, which is your white prison gang. Then you have your Hispanic prison gangs, which most people know the Mexican Mafia is one, and La Nostra Familia. And those two have branched out across the country in different names and forms. And then you have your black prison gang, the Black Guerrilla Family, which has branched out across the country for black prison gangs. Now, what had happened was back in the late 80s into the 90s, the street gangs kind of took over the drug trafficking. So in other words, you couldn't just, start up your mini microbus, drive down over the border in San Diego, go down to Baja California, buy yourself, a pound of weed, come back, make some nickel bags or dime bags, sell it, make a profit, like they did in the 60s. It doesn't work that way. You cannot deal drugs on any kind of level without being officially saying, yes, you can by the street gangs, or you'll end up dead. So now that organization has transpired, the prison gangs have decided, well, we want a cut of that because there's two entrance qualifications to be a prison gang member. Number one, be a street gang member, and number two, kill for the prison gang. So you can't be a prison gang member. So when you go to these prisons across the country, and the prison gang members are all murderers too. Mm-hmm. The audience has to understand that. That's how you get in. Now, why would you want to kill for the prison gang? Well, if you have, let's say you're a street gang member, right? And you go into prison and you did pay your taxes, so you're not going to die. Well, in their hierarchy, if you and I were in the military, right, we advance in rank from, if it's the Marine Corps, it'd be private to corporal to sergeant, right? On up. An officer, you'd start out lieutenant, captain, major. Well, for a street gang member, to be a prison gang member is sort of like going from enlisted to officer corps. They strive to do that. Mm-hmm. So when a street gang member goes in prison that hasn't paid their as us churchgoers call it a tithe, we call it taxes for them, percentage of the money they make, then there's a long list of street gang members ready to kill them so they can become a prison gang member. So Then what happened into is about in the 90s, the Aryan Brotherhood Mexican Mafia made a sort of like a treaty with the cartels, because in the 80s there was a war on drugs. Well, now after all the investigations, the cartel members were starting to get extradited by the good work of American law enforcement into the US prison system. So they wanted protection because by then the prison gangs were running the prisons. So the trade-off was, okay, you give us your balance sheets, what drugs are going to the street gangs, so we know how much money we're supposed to get. So that's how that whole triad sort of operates. Now, this triad wouldn't operate if the border was secure.
Mhm.
They couldn't get the drugs over. There's no way.
So,
So
Joseph,
they
let me ask you
rely
a
on.
question. Let me stop there a second. So the prison gangs know what the balance sheets are of the street gangs. The prison gangs, I presume, ostensibly are getting paid by the street gangs. So if they're getting paid in prison, where does that money go and how is it used? I mean, they're in prison, they don't have freedom and they can't go spend it. So what help the audience understand, what does it mean and why would the prison gangs want to get a piece of the cut of the street action? Is it pure ego, power? I mean, how does all that work?
Oh yeah, all the above. Extortion, getting their drugs, because another qualification in prison gangs, you have to love heroin. So how are they getting their heroin? Well, they're bribing people, right? I mean, so how does heroin and all these other drugs and cell phones and all these things end up in prison?
Hmm.
Well, they're either the visitors are bringing them in or they're corrupting some of the staff, but they're getting it. So, and it takes a lot of money to do that. And some of the money's being challenged to some of the prison gang members that eventually get out of prison, which that's a whole nother argument, but they do let them out of prison. And then they run their own little cartels out on the street with the street gang members from wherever they go out of prison. And that money is used for their power and operations and whatever.
So from a cartel perspective, they kind of view the prison gangs and the street gangs as their ultimate distribution network. That's probably oversimplification.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting.
Absolutely. Now, what they did is they already formed, throughout the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, all their channels for their drugs. So you have three main corridors. You have Texas, near El Paso, and you're going through Houston all the way up to Chicago, is the #1 corridor for drug trafficking in the country. Number 2 would be San Diego all the way up to the state of Washington, Vancouver, Canada. And the #3 would be in Florida all the way up through the East Coast. So these corridors are established with personnel, gang members, right, to move this stuff. So it's already done. So they don't have to, reinvent the wheel. It's already there. So what they decided is we already have the staff, we already have the quarters, we already have the infrastructure. So now let's start child sex trafficking, because when you sell heroin, you sell it once, you get your money, but you can't sell it again, it's gone. But if you sell a child, you can sell a child over and over and over again. So now with these same corridors and apparatuses and infrastructure, that's where the young girls are trafficked. And when we get into it, hopefully later, a young girl who's being trafficked isn't stationary. They move them around the country because of the gang affiliations.
Right. And just sell them again and again and again and again and again.
Correct, until they term out with age. And then that's what you have now. You have, if you go to any major city and you see prostitution, right? Mm-hmm. The adult women who are in prostitution most likely used to be abused as a child.
Right.
But they're not worth as much money anymore. So now they're out on the streets instead of how they sell them, the children, through the internet and in hotels and personal visits and houses and things like that.
Right, right. You're just fascinating. So, we have this in America, we have this issue with the blue line and the politics of policing and the politics and perception of police forces. And I think that's got to overlap at some level into the work you're doing and other people behind the scenes trying to deal with some of the real crimes that are going on. that we just don't see. You know, when you see a shooting of somebody in a city, that's what the media wants to focus on. So how challenging would you say is a current political narrative towards police forces and policing, in terms of how effective or ineffective law enforcement is in doing their job? It seems to me that if the political narrative is the way it is, and there's not the support, certainly for Backing the Blue, it would have a ripple effect into investigations and law enforcement that's pursuing drugs, human trafficking, etc.
Absolutely. And that with this, I look at a false narrative that's going on now in this country that somehow the police have it in for minority citizens, which is just, it's absurd. It's absurd. And the stats totally go against that. And me being on the street, I knew and saw police racism back in the 80s, but I also saw it cleaned up in the 90s, a la Rodney King. After the Rodney King incident, right, and actually as a private investigator, I was part of that investigation, one of the passengers in the car with Rodney King. So I know that case very well. That turned into a lot of reform in policing. So now when you go out in policing, it's nothing like it was in the 80s or 90s. It's completely changed. It's high professional. The police in this country are the best in the world, the best trained. They have hearts to serve. They love people. So when you have this false narrative, it's really hurtful, to people who really understand, hey, that's not what's going on here. That has nothing to do with it. But to address your question about how police can function, it's all about resources. So, for example, let's use child sex trafficking on this. If most of the time a child is a runaway, and I'll tell you a true story, if it's okay, to illustrate my point here. There was a 14-year-old girl in Reno, Nevada. It's a true story. And a gang member from San Diego, 26-year-old gang member, started to have conversations with her on social networking, of course, secretive. So he actually coerced mentally this young girl to leave the safety of her home, and he drove up to Sparks, Nevada, and she went out of her window. Mom came to get her. She was gone. She had no idea she's with this guy because all the answers were in here.
Right.
So what happens is the patrolman comes, takes a report, reports it to the National Crime Information Center run by the FBI. So if any police officer pulls this young girl over, they know she's a runaway and can take her. But a lot of our cases, and now it's 251 successful operations since December 2014, they tell the girl, the trafficker, as this one did, if we get pulled over, anything happens, don't tell them your real name, give them a phony name. And of course, you can't expect a 14-year-old girl to have ID. She just doesn't have ID, right? You don't get ID at 14. So what happened is he takes her to Mexico and starts flying her up with drugs and selling her. And the mother finally calls us because, let's go back to the police. He does his report. Most police officers get 3, 5, 6 days to finish their report. Then it goes over to a detective. Then it usually goes to a missing persons detective who gets it. And then they're probably overwhelmed. I mean, one detective, 50 to 150 reports. So they have to wait and go through all these other reports. And so because it's a runaway without any proof of they can't prove that anything happened. There was no kidnapping. If the child doesn't have an immediate medical emergency, then it's a runaway report, which is a very low priority report.
Right.
So the parents got a hold of us. We found her in 2 days. We coordinated with the federal law enforcement officials in Mexico and here in the country, an undercover operation, and got her back. Okay, and your audience can go to YouTube, Saved in America Mother, and you can see the reaction to the mom when we brought her daughter back over the border.
Right.
So that's what happens with runaways, and you can see the thing with resources. So now when you have this false narrative that put in these police officers in this bad light, now you have police officers leaving the field, right? You have defund the police. So now you have less resources, not more resources, less resources. So how do you move the runaway girl from a low priority to a higher priority when you don't have the resources?
Right.
Because you and I could be on patrol. We're on our computer, right? And the calls are coming in. And we have, oh, there's a runaway girl on Fifth Avenue. Oh, there's an armed robbery now on 2nd Street. Which call are we going to go to?
Yeah.
The armed robbery now. I mean, and that's just how it's prioritized. Because the solution for runaways, and I'll tell you some stats after this. And by the way, after we got the girl back, she went to rehab, and we actually had to go get her again. Unbelievably, this other gang, this guy, the bad guy, went 8 years to state prison. Another bad guy, prison gang member, got out, 40 years old, and he coerced her out. We had to get him locked up, and he's locked up now, and she's back in rehab. Yeah, so that happens because once you're 14, 15, 16-year-old and you have heroin, the opiate, all you want is that opiate. And that takes years of rehabilitation. Finding the child is only half the battle. The rehabilitation is the second half.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be the bigger half.
Anyway,
yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you have to, you have to lock down the child because the child wants to leave. And we've done operations in rehabilitation facilities where in California and our government here in California is kind of strange. I don't mind saying it. They have wacky laws, and they won't let a rehabilitation facility lock down a child who was under the influence of drugs and was trafficked. And so the pimps know that, so they just drive to the rehab facility on Friday, throw a cell phone over the fence. The girl who can't be locked down either climbs the fence or walks out the front, and he pimps her out all week and then drives her back to the rehab facility. And this is a true story. We did an operation with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department for 2 years on one of these operations, and ended up identifying over 50 young girls that was happening to over the 2-year process.
That is just hard to get one's mind wrapped around. If I could step back, Joseph, one of the things that what you were saying earlier, and this really comes down to, you need public support for policing, bottom line. What changes government policy, state policy, has to come from the people of America that see the problem, see the need, and really raise their voices, I would argue. And so when I think about what's going on politically and strategically with the Fund the Police, Rashid Tlaib just came out and said, basically, policing's racist. It's always been racist. And then you had the same day Barack Obama come out with a tweet that says, we need to reimagine policing. And I think about 45 years ago, he talked about a nationalized police force. So I think there's an agenda afoot to let the cities burn, to let things go crazy, and to really fundamentally restructure what is force in America, which I don't think is going in a good direction. And that's why I think it's so important to talk in this program that in America, we need the people to wake up with what's going on with human trafficking and everything you're talking about. They have to be outraged by it. There has to be energy behind it to change the policies. It's troubling to hear the laws in California, what you just described, where it's this sort of spinning door. We send them into rehab, and on the weekends, they're pulled back out. You'd think there'd be laws in place or some intention in places to help these women, these girls, in essence, that don't have the emotional maturity to really make decisions, that really aren't emotionally developing. I think you can talk to that, to know what's going on, and that they're sort of at the hands of their handler, their pimp, if you will, and probably feel threatened by that relationship. So all the way around, I think the politics, what's going on in America today, the assault on the police force itself, when you guys are doing God's work, is mind-boggling.
Well, the solution, which I'll get back to, you cannot nationalize a police force. It just can't have, doesn't work. There's no way it would ever work. It would be like some of the worst regimes in world history.
Right.
I mean, you can name them going backwards. It just doesn't work. It's absolute power, and absolute power is absolutely corrupt. I mean, you just can't do that. There's only one absolute power, and you and I both know it's God.
Right.
That's it. There is no such thing as absolute power after that. So what you need is a task force. Well, first of all, your audience needs to know, let's talk about this back to what you were saying, the funding of the policing and the public perception. If you love the idea of community police, that you could call your police department because someone's breaking in your house at night and you can get a response in 5 minutes, I mean, that's going to disappear if you just continue to defund the police. Okay, and then if you let this states like we have that are all across the country, about half of them, these gun control states, so then you can't even defend yourself when the police can't show up. So if someone comes to break into your house, you have to have a gun because you sure ain't going to get anywhere with the broomstick.
Right.
Okay, there's not, and my house has been broken into, and I've had to take people down with a firearm while I was a police commissioner. So, I mean, I totally understand that realm. A gun is everything in that situation. But the citizens have to go to their elected officials. And we're talking about their local officials.
Mhm.
You have to let them know how you feel. One of the biggest departments, and these are the sheriffs across this country, because the sheriffs are elected officials. Okay, so the sheriffs in this country need support from the citizens. If you don't support your sheriff, you're going to lose local policing. It's just the way it's going to go, because the sheriff is the chief executive of the county, whoever the sheriff is. So you have to have that relationship with the citizens, or eventually, like you were saying, there might be an attempt to nationalize everything. And if you nationalize it, you know, you have, first of all, the first round of defense will be the local sheriff. So, and then we'll get back to the solution to this as a task force. And the reason it's a task force is if you have a child sex trafficking task force and you use it with detectives that are familiar with both missing persons, you have detectives separately that are doing gang suppression, then you have detectives separately that are doing narcotics investigation. Well, today you could put those together, because if you show me a gang member, I'm going to show you a drug trafficker and a pimp. They're all one and the same nowadays.
Right.
So these structures have to combine with local, county, state, and federal, combine their resources and have a task force for this, and have a zero tolerance.
Right.
Organized crime. I mean, look what we did. It was only what, a couple decades ago, maybe a little more, back in the days of Rudy Giuliani. Remember that? And Police Commissioner Carrick, and dismantling organized crime back on the East Coast.
Mhm.
You know, your traditional, Hollywood has the Italian mafia and all that. They
Right.
basically neutralized them. Not saying they're gone, but they put a lot of resources, state, local, federal, county, into this, and they did a really good job doing it. But I don't think it's caught up to see. They don't see now that these street gang members, prison gang members, and the cartels is the same threat, when it's
Yeah.
actually, it's a worse threat.
Yeah, 100%, which we'll get into in a second. I want to go back just for the audience edification. You founded Saved in America with the mission of assisting parents and law enforcement to locate missing, runaway, and exploited children, specifically the most vulnerable in sex trafficking. And since 2014, you mentioned you've recovered 251 children, which just hats off to your team. So who makes up the team of Saved in America specifically?
Sure, we have 32 volunteer members here in San Diego County, because this is where we started. It really helps because of the SEAL presence. You have Coronado is one of their training bases. So that helps solidify that core group. Then we have over 100 reserves across the country. So we have 3 divisions here in San Diego. We have our Special Operations Division, which are our military special operators. And of course, all these people I'm talking about all become licensed insured private investigators. So we have our Special Ops Division, and we have our Police Division, and then we have our Tech Ops Division. And with the special operators, they all have an extensive background in surveillance and self-control and surveillance. So in policing, you have all the laws that we need to know. The guys need to know when they're on the street, this is what you can and can't do. And of course, we're all trained. I train everyone in private investigation technique and business and professions codes and confidentialities, and all that goes with being a licensed private investigator. And then we have the Tech Ops Division, which does our drones and our social networking, our human intel, and all that. So, and that's usually filled, most of them are veterans. We have quite a few Marines in that division. And together, I could tell you using our program, and I'll show you now, your audience, we have a acronym, and this is on our website, called RESCUE. It's our 6-step recovery process. And it talks about how each of these divisions work together to start with receiving the initial call from the parent all the way down to recovering the child and getting her into a rehab situation. And if possible, filing a civil suit against the bad guy. And we just won a $250,000 judgment against someone who harbored one of the girls. And we're going to use that money, if we're ever able to collect, to help with the child's vocational training or college or whatever she needs it for in rehabilitation.
That's incredible. So that was my next question: is how is Saved in America funded or supported?
All privately. Now we did get a nice gift, and I have to give credit to the San Diego County Board of Supervisors. We were doing operations where we couldn't do multiple. We could only do like one at one time. So they gifted us with the mobile command center. So, and that's based on what policing does, right? You have a mobile command center, so you can do different things at different places with one point of communication that isn't, at the police station, because you can't do it there, because you have to go, far enough away. So the San Diego County Board of Supervisors gifted us a grant for a mobile command center. We could do multiple operations at once. But the rest of the money, all the rest of the money is all private donation.
And then go to your website and make that donation, correct?
Correct, savedinamerica.org.
Great. So, I was able to see some videos you were in, and, behind the glossy image of Southern California with weather waves and what are you carefree days, what is the reality of child sex trafficking in San Diego and Southern California writ large? It seems to me like there's this dark underbelly. We're right with across from Mexico, which is a major border with Southern California. How would you describe the reality in these Tony communities?
Well, it goes back to what we talked about. It's gang controlled, and because of the border, that has everything to do it. For example, we talked San Diego second in the nation in narcotics trafficking, but it's also second in child sex trafficking. Now, you think, okay, why is San Diego, with these beautiful neighborhoods, we're talking, Del Mar and all these beautiful beaches, Coronado and everything, is there just that many more perverted men in San Diego? And it's just, perverted men are kind of across the grain, the same across the country. It's because that's where the suppliers are. That's where the street gang members are. Now, a couple quick statistics for your audience. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, at any one time, and as we speak, there's 300,000 missing kids across the country, American kids. Okay, there was a study done by Dr. Amy Carpenter of University of San Diego, and that study is in the back of our textbook. We just finished the 4th edition, called Investigation of Missing and Exploited Children, the Gateway to Child Sex Trafficking. So all these are it's sourced very well. Thank God I went to college and learned how to do that, to put that all together. Right. So according to this study, a minimum of 30% of runaway children are trafficked. So if you put that together with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children statistic, as we're speaking, there's 100,000 American children being enslaved and trafficked as we speak. And that is because of this, again, this organization, this evil triad of the street gang, prison gang, and cartels. Now, one more note about here in San Diego County, and that's because it's our home base. So I do research once a week on all the missing kids in San Diego and Orange County, the next county on the coast of San Diego. And this is the latest I have. Right now, in the city of San Diego, there's 8 missing girls ranging from age 12 to 17.
Mhm.
In El Cajon, a neighboring city, a 14-year-old is missing. And in Escondido, there's a 16-year-old girl missing. So that's 14 kids in San Diego County just currently this week. In Orange County, you have a 17-year-old missing in Huntington Beach, beautiful city. Fullerton, 3 missing kids, 15, 16, and 17. And in the area of the county area, including San Diego, Lake Forest, Orange, and Trabuco Canyon, 14-year-old and 3 15-year-olds. And this is just current.
Yeah.
And I can tell you another stat, this will blow your mind. Now, we do joint operations with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and Sheriff Joe Lombardo's office. Talk about a great sheriff. Joe Lombardo is one of the great sheriffs. As he stated before, what happens, and if it happens out in San Diego and Texas and Florida, it happens 3 times as much in Las Vegas.
Right.
So we're getting ready to do another joint operation with them the end of this month. Actually, we'll be there the 29th and 30th operating with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. So as we speak, there's 12 missing kids right now in the metropolitan area of Las Vegas, from 13 years old to 17-year-old, 12 of them with an average age of 15 and a half years old.
And these are American citizens, right? They're not people coming from foreign countries being trafficked. These are bona fide American citizens, right?
Correct. The vast majority are. There's a few that might be, and that it's harder to find, to determine whether they're citizenship or not. And that's one of the reasons for that is 60% of all trafficked kids are foster kids. So their parent is the government. And that's a whole nother dilemma.
Yeah. Yeah. That's and it's really hard to recover unless you get the right, with the right people and the right programs. So let me get on a little bit of soapbox with what's going on with the border right now. But the United States, in my opinion, is now the #1 importer of child sex trafficking in the world. The Biden administration, for all intents and purposes, in my opinion, is working hand in hand with the cartels by virtue of such a weak policy as compared to the Trump administration. And I think it's really bringing sex trafficking to a whole nother level within America. So given the Biden administration's intentionally weak border policies, how has the border crisis affected your job in particular? Do you see an influx? I mean, what kind of dynamic are you now witnessing with what's going on at the border?
Well, the rate of trafficked American children, which we deal with because we have to have a reporting person, and the reporting person will be the parent. Or we go into an operation like in Las Vegas and we use research from different organizations to find out what the children that are missing, and then we'll go out and try to reach the parent if we can, if they're not a foster kid. But we have like an underbelly of child sex trafficking because these children, nobody's reporting them missing.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? There's no reporting person. And this vast underbelly, which you can't really calculate because there's no data to calculate it, is what you're talking about. How many of these foreign children now have slid into this underbelly of child sex trafficking in the country? And how do we know unless you rescue them? You're never going to have anybody call up and say, help, my child's missing. You're not going to get a parent from Honduras to call you and say, well, I let my child, I paid $5,000 and let my 13, 14, and 15-year-old go. And can you go find him now? That's just not going to happen. So now you have this underbelly, which I think is totally exasperating the problem. It's creating more wealth for the bad guys, for the street gangs, cartels, and prison gang members, because now there's this unreported underbelly of crime, which how are you going to know it even exists unless you stumble on it?
So let me ask you this. So there's a supply, which is with the border policy, Biden's helping the supply end of the equation, but then there's the demand end of the equation. What drives the demand? I think I know the answer to this, but if you had no demand, they would pivot to something else, right? It wouldn't be human trafficking. Maybe it would be gun running. So let's talk a little about the demand side of this.
I personally, as a pastor, I understand a little bit about good and evil. I mean, and I'll go a little bit into the Bible for your audience so they understand where my mind is coming from. I didn't just make this up. This actually has a platform. And most people know this. There were two trees in the garden. There was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, that word knowledge, when you take it to its Hebrew from Genesis, it really means that knowledge that you can never figure out of good and evil. In other words, the unknown. So every person, according to scripture, has in their own way, like our parents, Adam and Eve, were the first people on earth 6,000 years ago, not 60 million, 6,000 years ago. And they picked the tree of the knowledge of good and evil instead of the tree of life. Mm-hmm. But all of us have in their own way, after the age of accountability, which we know to be between 10 and 12 or somewhere around there, we chose that tree too. So we all missed the mark of the tree of life. We missed the perfection of that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what has happened is, even though we picked that tree, unless you turn around, and I call this out of John 3:3 being born again. That's what Jesus said. You must be born again, or you must have a new spiritual nature, is basically the opportunity to go back in the garden spiritually and choose again. So if you're now on God's side and you recognize, wow, I chose the wrong tree. Now you have an opportunity to choose the right tree, the tree of life. But there's so many people who don't want that. They want the pride that comes with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
And that's the perspective. If you're talking about how could anyone want to go pay money for a child, to rape a child, because that's rape.
Yep.
Right. When you have sex with a young girl that's under 18 years old, that's rape. So you're going to pay money to commit a rape. That's a choice, a continual choice for the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, you want to say what's good and you want to say what's evil. Mm-hmm. So you want to turn around. That's obviously, as I'm speaking to this, and most of your audience is listening to this, yeah, that's wrong. You're giving $100 to somebody so you can rape a child.
Right.
Well, that's wrong.
Yep.
But that person, no, I'm going to make this right. You see where I'm going?
No,
so that's how I see it. And you're never going to stop that demand. Now you can slow it down, and you should, and the police do have sting operations where they put phony ads right on the internet, and all these people, you read them all over, 34 men, come for are enticed to go to this location, right? That it was an undercover officer all the time and get arrested. You need to keep doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's never going to go away. Now, some people, I just want to say this real quickly. Some people might say, well, just legalize prostitution and drop the age. The ridiculousness of that, right? Drop the age to 16, permission, or 15 or 14, and then you won't have the crime.
Yeah.
Where do these people come from?
Yeah. Well, that makes you believe in aliens, maybe, because they're just crazy in that thinking. I mean, the idea that exploiting kids is at any level good and it doesn't have massive societal impact is certainly not well thought up. And as you were talking, it reminded me, one time I was listening to a heart surgeon speak. He was a heart transplant surgeon. In fact, I'm trying to think of his name. He's been on Oprah a number of times. Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz. And I actually worked with him in the past. And I remember he brought up a cartoon, and the cartoon was of a surgeon with a mop in his hands, mopping the floor right below a sink where the faucet's turned on and it's overflowing. And he goes, this is analogous of when I have a patient come to me with heart disease because of all the factors, lifestyle, smoking, obesity, that they don't want to address, that I'm really just addressing the water on the floor, and I can fix them in a surgery. But as we know, they will be back. And so the idea that you guys are out there doing the Lord's work, trying to recover these children, yet there's this hot demand out there because of the good and evil, because of the nature of man, if you will. It's almost like you got to have programs and policies to deal with the sort of the scoop up operations where you're protecting these kids, but certainly on the demand end, I think we could look at some of those things. And, the idea that all these, political issues, whether it be abortion or pornography, whatever, and I love what you had to say, because it's really that dichotomy of good and evil. And, oh, by the way, we're in charge of that. That presumes that people walk in wisdom as opposed to impulse, right? Or walk in love versus lust, right? And they don't. They walk in impulse and lust, and the flesh, whatever feels good in the moment, they do. And we all know that when you make those choices of maybe raping a child, inside, there is a true north in there somewhere. And we all know that's not a great feeling that produces. So you'd hope that would be a guide to most people to say, maybe I shouldn't do that. But as society continues to go down and try to kick God out of it, which I think there's an active effort to do, it's not going to get better. You can hire a nationalized police force, and human nature left to its own depravity is a big challenge, right? So I think at some level, there's got to be a balance and a recognition that whatever's feeding the lusts, whatever's feeding the flesh, whatever's feeding this demand from a policy standpoint should at least be addressed and looked into, because you guys are doing an incredible work, but the demand's only going to increase, especially with this issue with the border.
Well, you take morality out of any equation. And, St. Thomas Aquinas talked about this quite a bit. You take morality out of the equation, then you turn into animals. I mean, look what happened to Nazi Germany. You can just study that. I mean, there's hundreds of examples, not just Nazi Germany. There's 100 examples all the way back, to the great empires in Babylon and in Middle Persia, in Rome, in Greece, et cetera, et cetera. You take morality, you make a government or an institution immoral. That institution is going to fall. That government is going to fall. You and I both know God's in control of everything. If man wants to form a government and become God and form their own national police and then dictate what morality is, the end result of that government and those people is going to be just like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
They're going to cease to exist.
100%. So speaking of the laws, where's Gavin Newsom and the state officials at in terms of combating sex trafficking?
How about a big silence?
Yeah.
There's nothing.
Isn't Gavin Newsom the one that was okay with underage boys being with men? I believe that I read that somewhere. I mean, that's kind of telling.
That was, we were on a couple news stations talking about that. And that is another example of, well, let's just make immorality moral and it goes away.
Right.
And that it doesn't go away. Because what happens is, and people know this, you should know this, prisons are full of this. You start allowing men to have sex with adult women, 18 and over, and legalize that. Let's just do that. Because that's an argument, right? Legalize prostitution, right? As if these adult prostitutes weren't victims of child sex trafficking. Like let's just call people who think that ignorant. And that'll just be a nice way to say it.
Right.
So what's going to happen? This person who knows that's even wrong, right? Now it's not going to satisfy them. Well, what's the difference between an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old? So you legalize the 17-year-old. Oh, well, what's wrong? How about a 16-year-old? And it's going to keep going down and down and down. And if you read any of the interviews with pedophiles, and I'm talking ones that are just wholly terrific. Yeah. People have sex with toddlers and other children. You know where it started? It started with up here. It started with prostitution, and it went down that way. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, oh, there's a baby. I'm going to go have sex with the baby.
Right.
That's a process of immorality to get to that.
Well, it's kind of like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the Democratic senator in the 70s or 80s. He had this famous term he coined, defining deviancy downward. And everything's a slippery slope, whether it be drugs, gateway drugs, the harder drugs, or pornography, to even more perverted forms of sex. you see that slippery slope. When you have state officials condoning it, encouraging it, suggesting it, it says to me, we need new state officials. We need new leadership fundamentally. I think, this idea with the news media and propaganda and fake news and how they're trying to create the narrative from a race standpoint or a police standpoint. I hope Americans really wake up. And I think by and large, more and more are, because I think we're a good country. I think Americans are good people. They're really smart. But I think it's easy to stay in a catatonic state of social media, pop culture, of trying to feel good about the reality around us, right? When in reality, we got to really become more aware, because it's really the collective voice, I would argue, of Americans where they say enough's enough, that the politicians will take heed.
Absolutely. It's the heart of the people, and the people are going to get what they vote for.
Yeah.
So if the people's heart wants to grab this immoral behavior and make immorality legal, you're going to elect somebody who wants to do that.
Right.
And people have to wake up and say, I don't want this anymore. I don't want my neighbor to see my neighbor crying because her 14-year-old girl was seduced out of her home by some gangbanger that wants to sell her just for a buck,
right?
Just for money, because he or she is that heartless to do that to their fellow human being, because they haven't learned anything about morality. You look at some of these protests; they're not protests; they're riotous.
Right.
And people, jumping on police cars. How is that going to solve anything? That's just riotous behavior. That's evil behavior.
Right.
And you look slowly trying to make that acceptable. Well, because something you don't like happens, then you grab a whole bunch of your friends that are probably most bangers and ex-cons or whatever, and let's just go destroy everything, push it on fire, jump on public property because you don't have to pay for it, and there's no results of your crime. You don't get punished.
Yeah.
So it's the same factors that you're talking about. And I hope America does wake up. I mean, one of the big problems, and I think you know it as well as most people, well, not most people, but at least half of us, the problem with public school education. Now, there was another study, and I'll bring that back into it. In San Diego County, there's at least one recruiter for gang members, one child sex recruiter in every junior and senior high school in San Diego County.
Really?
Because gang members have constitutional rights to go to school. So they recruit girls out of the public schools. And public school education is going to have to take a real hard look at what they're teaching kids. They're teaching kids, they're getting away from reading, writing, and arithmetic and science and going into all this social ridiculousness. And I don't even mind saying the social justice ridiculousness.
Right.
I'll share with you. And I go back on a ministry. I go back every once in a while to a junior college class that does social justice. And I'll sit undercover as some poor veteran, right? To watch this ridiculous professor try to shove this theory of nonsense social justice on these kids around me that are 18, 19, 20, and 21 in classrooms. And of course, then I peel off the layer of who I really am. And by the end of the school semester, all the kids are coming out and saying, thank you very much for what you're doing. We had no idea that this was wrong.
Yeah.
And, that's the pervasiveness of immorality that's going on. And it's being done right under our eyes in our public school systems.
And we're paying for it. I mean, we're paying for the education to train people to hate the country, right? I mean, if you look at critical race theory, you look at everything you're talking about and how these kids are coming out and how they think about things. To me, it's part of an overarching agenda, right? Whether it be the morality of the country, totally changing the nature of the country, the idea that we're okay with riotous behavior where it's clear from a rule of law, laws have been violated. Otherwise, you're living in anarchy. And I think about China and Russia, and I think they have systems that have nothing to be desired. But however, they have organized societies that wouldn't put up with what we're putting up with in America. And the idea that what's going on in Minneapolis and what preceded that event, and people don't want to look at some of the character aspects or the dynamics, and they just want to ignore that and go right to the kid that was killed and then turn it into something else. is interesting for sure, and very concerning and troubling. And I think you brought up some good points. I think when America is brought to the precipice, we think about the 1776 revolution, it got to that point because people got brought to the precipice where they're willing to die for something way bigger than them, for their family, for the future generations. And I think what you're seeing in America today, whether it be the elections, whether it be the border crisis, whether it be the economics, everybody has their hot button at which point they wake up. It may not be human trafficking, right? It may not be what we're talking about, but there's enough going on with the agenda in America today that I think little by little, people start to wake up and say, wait a minute, this is not the America I voted for or I want to live in. And I think it has to get to that point where people start to take action in a quality way. Because I always come back to the American people are really smart if they have the data points that are not shaped from a biased propaganda, Marxist leaning media, but really is shaped by facts, right? Where they can use their own brains to say, I look at the issues, I look at the facts I've been given, and I can make an assessment and a reasonable conclusion as to what's really going on.
Well, you and I and others have studied history in true history. And that's another problem is some of the kids now in public schools, they're not getting real history. They're getting a watered down version or a corrupted version of history. So these kids don't really know any different, and they're not taking the time to go and research it. I've been blessed. My son, Joshua, is a police officer, and he's our law enforcement liaison. I was blessed to be able to put him in private school, and he got an excellent education, went on, became a Marine and fought in Iraq, and then went on, became an All-American heavyweight wrestler at Liberty University and graduated from Liberty. And he's just a wonderful young man. Not just that he's my son, he's just a wonderful, wonderful person. But he had the blessing. I saw that, and I said, I am not. I'm a product of the public school system, LA Unified. It was bad in the 70s. I did time as a school resource officer, as a police officer in the 80s. It was bad in the 80s, and I can't imagine what it's like now. I just can't imagine.
It's crazy. So those who are watching the podcast and want to get involved in your mission, what are some practical next steps they can take? I was talking to someone the other day, and she's like, man, I got a heart for this issue, and it's really important to get involved. And so people that are watching this podcast, what can they do practically to contribute or make an impact with human trafficking?
There's a couple things. Number one, go to the website and be informed. That's number one. You have to know what's going on. And just about this talk, which is, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to give this to your audience, because they probably wouldn't have known. Child sex trafficking, where does this come from? So we have a nice media page. I think we've been in 200 to 300 media outlets, from, like you said, NBC Nightly News, HBO Vice, People Magazine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then visit your elected officials, support your sheriffs again. Let them know that we support you to try to get rid of the enslavement of our children with child sex trafficking. We want to do this. And they'll put a budget together for their supervisors, whoever they answer to. Say, the people out here want this, and they'll get it done because they know how to get it done.
Right.
Go to your local politicians, get these laws changed about can't lock down a rehab facility so the pimps can come and re-rape these girls, again, okay, and victimize them again. If you feel like giving money, I try not to ask for money, because I think that's an issue between you and God in your heart. So if you see what you want to, you just go in there. There's plenty of opportunity on there. They said we're going to an operation with Las Vegas. We're going to go hopefully in Phoenix in 2 months to do a joint operation in Arizona. And we're thinking about going to New Orleans, the Atlanta area. So of course, all that costs money, transportation, gas, hotels, food, everything that goes with that. If you know any licensed private investigators, current or former, current or retired peace officers, or former special operators, have them go to our website under the volunteer tab and to volunteer and become part of our reserve program. So when we get a call from we had a call from a a mom in Dallas, and her 14-year-old girl left. And we did all the workup and everything, but we were able to call boots on the ground who are already there in Texas, licensed private investigators, to go help and assist the police to eventually recover the child. So that's a big thing. If you want to volunteer in any other way, go to the volunteer section and see which way. Just send us a note, send us an email. Hey, this is what I am, and this is what I'm about, and I have a heart for this, and we'll try to, fit you in that. But the biggest thing is get the word out. Your community groups, your politicians, like again, your sheriff's department, and say enough's enough. I am not going to live in a country where we enslave our children. Just we're going to stop that right now.
Right. That's a very strong wrap-up message. So is there anything, Joseph, we haven't covered that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes, one more thing. And that I want to talk about the groom process, so your audience knows this is how it happens. I'll tell you how it works. This is our acronym groom, 5-step process. Number 1, gain trust. The pimp or the gang member or their associate will gain trust of your child, and then what they'll do is they want to keep it private. So they have your child communicate them with some kind of app or some kind of something that don't tell anybody about this conversation. And they seduce or they solicit the child either in the public school arena, at a mall, with the phony thing, oh, you're so pretty, you should be a model type of thing. Hey, young lady, if you're in a mall and some idiot comes up to you and says, you're so pretty, you should be a model. Agents don't work like that, okay? It's a pimp. Go tell mall security.
Right.
Step 2, require intoxication. They always use intoxicants with the gateway drug of marijuana to go into ecstasy, Xanax, and eventually they want the child to take an opiate because then they have them. They're addicted to the opiate. They operate from alienation of family and friends. They'll use gangster rap, hip hop music with the gangster lifestyle. This is the lifestyle that's cool. Don't believe what your parents, your friends are telling you. That's ridiculous. Their ridiculous morals don't mean anything. They just don't want you to have fun. And they pound that into them and say, I'm the one who cares about you. I'm the one who really loves you. Aren't I the one giving you the drugs to make you feel good? You see, and they seduce them with that. Then they go to open immorality. That immorality is good. It's the new thing. See, the old morals were bad. The immorality is the new way. It's the better way. And then step 5, Pam, it's all about the money.
Wow. I don't know what to say to that. That's that's a lot to get your mind around. But you know what? Everything you just described feels about right about how they can manipulate these young women. And one of the things I've heard in other conversation is, when they take these women at a young age, 12, 13, 14, and there's a 7-year or 6-year gap or 4-year gap before they're recovered again, or they're no longer useful or profitable. They've missed all those development stages emotionally and mentally, right? So it's really hard to extract them out of that lifestyle. And they're going to always protect their pimp because, again, we're getting the drugs, the lifestyle. And these people are like fed hamburgers and in these really seedy motels, and they think that's a good deal, even though they've come from their families. So it's remarkable how they're able to manipulate psychologically, enslave psychologically, and get these people, these kids, to believe that this is the better way. It's just amazing how they go through that process.
Well, a lie, there can't be a lie unless you have truth, right? Because we know a lie is a perversion of truth. So they try to stay really close to truth and then pervert it. Right. So there's a little bit of the truth, but their truth is better than truth. And you can look at that all through anything that's immoral in this country. It's a perversion of truth. Because like I said, again, truth can exist without a lie. Lie can't exist without truth.
Right. Very well said, Joseph. Joseph, thank you so much. Continued success with your organization, Saved in America. I just admire what you and your team are doing. It's such an important issue and an important time in America's history. And we certainly wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
All right. Till next time.